Noam, you just came back from Australia, and I was wondering if you had anything new to report. Was it the first time you visited the country?
It was, in fact, the first time I'd visited Australia. It was the primary invitation was from the...
Noam, you just came back from a trip to Australia. I was wondering if you could share with listeners some of your thoughts on what happened there, and was it your first visit to the country?
It was indeed my first visit to Australia. I was there for 8 or 9 days, I guess. Pretty constant schedule of talks and interviews and the usual stuff. And it was the usual range of topics, enormous and very interested audiences. A lot of radio and television. The main invitation was from the East Timor Relief Association. There's a substantial Timorese community there. And I gave talks primarily on that. That was one major focus. And, of course, on Australia's policies towards East Timor and other things, and also, domestic economic policies and stuff. The timing turned out to be very propitious. There is right now, in fact, yesterday opened at the World Court a major case, which I haven't seen reported here, but it's been reported widely in the world press and, of course, enormously in Australia. It's at the World Court. It involves Portugal and Australia, and it has to do with a robbery of the oil of East Timor in a treaty signed between Australia and Indonesia. One primary reason we know from leaked diplomatic cables and so on for the Western support for the Indonesian invasion of East Timor, which was sort of near genocidal, was the fact that they thought they could make a better deal on robbing the oil resources with Indonesia than they could either with Portugal, which was the administering power, or an independent East Timor. That was stated explicitly in diplomatic cables during the period when the governments were pretending that they didn't know that the invitation was imminent, but of course they did know. So that's a big issue now, both the World Court hearing and the very fact that this is taking place, which is kind of on a par with Libya making a deal with Iraq to exploit Kuwait's oil, assuming they hadn't been driven out. It's roughly like that. So that was one big issue, and since it is just coming up to the World Court, of course, that was timely. The other thing was that, well, in fact, as I landed at the airport, the first headline that greeted me in the national newspaper, Australian, was that Australia had agreed to sell advanced assault rifles to Indonesia, which of course are not to be used to defend Indonesia from China. They're being used to crush for internal repression and for the military occupation of East Timor, where the fighting is still going on and the repression is very severe. What the point is that Australia found a niche market because the United States had backed away from that finally, under lots of pressure here, congressional pressure and popular pressure. The United States finally got to the point of withholding some arms, at least small arms, from the killers, and Australia instantly moved in. And the cynicism of that was a little hard to miss. It's also, you have to remember, people in Australia know that, even if they don't read about it in school books, but they remember that about 60,000 Timorese were killed during the Second World War. What happened is that right after Pearl Harbor, Australia and Holland, Timor was a Portuguese colony, half Dutch, half Portuguese. The Portuguese part would have probably remained neutral through the war, because, like Macau, which is another Portuguese colony right around Japan, never violated neutrality. If Portugal was a fascist country, it was a semi-ally. So chances are Timor would have remained neutral. Anyhow, Australia invaded, and about 10 days after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese counter-invaded, and there were a couple hundred Australian commandos there, and they were able to survive, the ones who did, mostly because of assistance from Timorese. Otherwise they would have been wiped out instantly. In the court, then they finally were withdrawn, but of course the Timorese were left, and the ones who the Japanese thought had supported them got totally slaughtered. There were about 60,000 people killed. That fighting on Timor. It's right. If you look at the geography, you'll see how it works. The Japanese might well have gone on to invade Australia. It looked like they were going to. They never did. They bombed, but they never invaded. And probably the fighting on Timor stopped them. So 60,000 Timorese dead may have certainly saved a lot of lives of Australian commandos and may have saved Australia from being invaded. And that's to repay that debt by being the only country in the world to officially recognize the occupation, to steal the oil, to arm the murderers. It doesn't go over very well in the population. And there's also been tremendous cynicism in the government in justifying this and so on. So there's a kind of a backlog of resentment and concern, plus the fact that it's right next door, so they get Timorese refugees and so on. So it's a big issue.
You also gave a presentation on anarchy. Is there a lively anarchist movement in Australia?
Well, I'm not in any much position to comment on that, but the meeting was at the town hall in Sydney, which they tell me has a couple of thousand people there, and it was overflowing. And they'd had an all-day conference with plenty of people, so something's lively. I was, what these trips are like. I mean, you run from one talk to another, so I can't really comment on what the movements are like.
I have a glimpse of what you go through. In November, I was in Seattle and Olympia, and I gave 3 public talks, 3 interviews, and a workshop in a day and a half. And at the end of that time, my brains were completely fried. I had no idea what I said to whom. And I was wondering, how do you keep not just your equilibrium and equanimity, but that separation of what you said?
Well, as far as I know, I have only one talent. I'm not trying to be modest. I think I know what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. But the one talent that I have, which I know other friends don't seem to have, is that there's something I got some quirk in my brain which makes it work like separate buffers in a computer. I don't know, if you play around with a computer, you can put things in different places and they just stay there, and you can go back to them whenever you feel like it, and they're there. And I can somehow do that. Like I can write a very technical paper in snatches, piece on an airplane, then another piece 3 weeks later, and 6 months later finally get back to it and sort of pick up where I left off and so on. So it's somehow I don't have any problem switching very quickly from one thing to another and then picking up. In fact, I've had other friends like this. I had one friend now died, a well-known logician in Israel, an Israeli logician who was a very close friend, and we would see each other every 5 years or 6 years or something, and we would always just pick up the conversation where we left it off, just without any break, without any noticing it particularly. In fact, didn't even notice it until people seemed to find it strange and so on.
Did your thoughts while you were in Australia ever turn to Alex Carey, the man you dedicated Manufacturing Consent to?
Very much so. In fact, I was there for a book launch. His book of essays, posthumous essays, was published by the University of New South Wales, where he taught, and I have an introduction to it, in fact. And one of the things I did was go to the launch of the book, and was able to talk there a bit and meet the family and so on. Also met some old friends who I knew through and with Alex when he visited here years back. So there are a lot of personal stuff too.
What's memorable about his work? What was his contribution?
Well, Alex Carey did the pioneering work in an extremely important field, which in fact has yet to be investigated. That's the field of corporate propaganda, which is a major phenomenon in the modern world and almost unstudied. His most important essay, which has been circulating underground for years, I've duplicated endless copies and circulated it myself, was never published, opens by pointing out that he says it better than this, but the thesis is that there have been 3 major phenomena in the 20th century with regard to democracy. One is the extension of the franchise, which was broad. The second was the growth of corporations. And the third was the efforts of corporations to undermine democracy. And he's exactly right. That's why we have a public relations industry. It was established approximately at the time that corporations reached their current form early in the century. And it was created in order, as they put it, to control the public mind, because they recognized that the public mind would be the greatest hazard facing industrialists. And they understood that democracy is a real threat to private tyranny, just as it's a threat to state tyranny. And since we are in a system of private tyranny, which was in fact being established early in the century, and very consciously so, in fact, consciously established as an attack on individual liberty. That's a part of corporate law which is only known in scholarly circles, but true. Part of this was to ensure that democracy couldn't function. And this required, since you don't have some degree of state violence, but limited degrees, especially with the increase in the franchise and participation and so on, it was understood right off that you have to control opinion. And that led to the huge public relations industry, massive propaganda campaigns, efforts to sell Americanism and harmony and to sell American capitalism, and people are just deluged with propaganda on this through the Advertising Council and radio and television and the media and so on. It's very conscious. And Carey's the first person to have seriously studied it, and almost the last person. Now there's a little literature on it coming along now, but it's a topic of such incredible significance in the 20th century that it ought to be a major focus. We are immersed in it all the time. And it explains a lot of... the United States is different from other countries in this respect. It has a much more class-conscious business community for all kind of historical reasons. It didn't develop out of feudalism and aristocracy and so on, so there weren't the conflicting factors that you had in other places. So there's a highly class-conscious business community, very Marxist in character, kind of vulgar Marxist, so fighting a bitter class war, very aware of it. You read their internal publications, it's like, reading Maoist pamphlets half the time. They don't spend billions of dollars a year in propaganda for the fun of it. They do it with a purpose, and the purpose is to try to, for a long time, the purpose was to kind of resist and contain human rights and democracy and the whole sort of welfare state framework that developed, social contract that developed over the years. They wanted to contain it and limit it. And now they feel that the current period is one in which they feel they can really roll it back. They can go right back to satanic mills, murdering poor people at will, basically the social structure of the early 19th century. That's the situation we're in right now. And these huge propaganda offensives are a major part of it. Carey's the real importance of his work is that it's the first effort, and till now the major effort, to bring some of this to public attention. He's had a tremendous influence on the work I've done. Actually, Ed Herman and I dedicated our book, Manufacturing Consent, to him. He had just died. And it was not just intended as a symbolic gesture. He got both of us started in a lot of this work.
You just mentioned Rollback. It's also the title of two essays in Z Magazine that you just wrote. That was originally a Cold War term.
Yeah, well, I picked it up from that. The standard line, so you read the Clinton Doctrine as announced by Anthony Lake, the intellectual in the administration, is that for years we've been involved in containment of a threat to market democracy. Now we're going to enlarge it, So he's picking Cold War imagery. And I think the Cold War imagery is appropriate, except that he's got it backwards. For years we've been involved in containment of democracy, freedom, human rights, and even markets. And now we're going to be able to roll them back. Rollback is another Cold War term. The traditional Cold War policies where we oscillate between containment and rollback. Containment is sort of Kennan's policy. You prevent the Soviet power from expanding. That's containment. Rollback has been, in fact, official U.S. policy since 1950, and C-68 is the core Cold War document, is an advocacy of rollback. In fact, that's when Kennan was thrown out and Nitze and others came in. Rollback meant we undermine and destroy Soviet power, and we make we reach negotiations with a successor state or states, as NSC put it. That's rollback. So these are traditional Cold War notions, and I think they're very appropriate, except that they're misplaced. Containment is in fact correct, but it wasn't containment of a Soviet threat. It was containment of the threat of freedom, democracy, human rights, other threats to authority. And now they can feel they can move on to rollback. So unravel the entire social contract that was developed through large-scale social popular struggle over a century and a half, which did create, sort of soften the edges of predatory private tyranny, and often soften them a lot. So like, say, in Germany, for example, workers have fairly reasonable conditions. So that has to be rolled back, and we have to go back to the days when you have basically slavery, wage slavery, as it was called, in fact, by working people in the 19th century. No rights. The only rights you get are the rights you gain on the labor market. If your children can't make enough money to survive, they starve. Your choices are the workhouse prison, the labor market, whatever you can get there, or, well, you go back to the early days, the 1820s, the line was, or go somewhere else, meaning go to the places where white settlers are massacring the populations and opening them up, like the United States and Australia, for example. But, of course, now that option's gone. You don't go somewhere else. So the choices are limited to the other two that the founders of modern economics, like Ricardo and Malthus and others, pointed out: workhouse prison, or starvation, or whatever you can gain on the labor market, and you don't have any rights on the labor market because it's just a market. That, in fact, is the foundation of the intellectual tradition that is called classical economics, now neoliberalism and so on. And the idea is to go right back to that with one crucial difference. There's a little secret that everybody knows, but you're not supposed to say, and that is that nobody who advocated this believed a word of it. They always wanted a very powerful state which intervenes massively, but it's a welfare state for the rich. That's the way the U.S. was founded. In fact, the U.S. pioneered that development. It's been the most anti-market of all of the industrial societies, and this is well known. Alexander Hamilton is the one, in fact, who invented the concept of infant industry protection and modern protectionism. And the U.S. has always been a pioneer and a bastion of protectionism, which is why it's a rich, powerful country. Another slight secret of economic history, again well known in economic history, is that free market policies have been an utter disaster. Anyone who was subjected to them got smashed, which is why the Third World looks the way it is. They were forced on the Third World, and every single developing society has radically violated those principles, the United States more than most. And in fact, that's closely correlated with growth. In fact, if you look historically, protectionism actually is correlated with trade even. The more protectionism, the more trade, for a simple reason. Protectionism enhances growth, and growth enhances trade. So things are not, these are sort of truisms of economic history, I should say, but that's the sideline to the, for poor people and working people, they have to be subjected to market discipline. That part is true, but the other side, which is less said, is that rich people are going to have a nanny state protecting them, and a powerful one, and subsidizing them.
One of the heroes of the current right-wing revival, I'm not going to use the term conservative, but the current right-wing revival is Adam Smith. Now, you've done some pretty impressive research into Adam Smith that has excavated, as the postmodernists would say, a lot of information that's not coming out. You've often quoted Smith's calling the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, all for ourselves and nothing for other people. Where and when did you do this work on Smith?
I didn't do any research at all on Smith. I just read him. There's no research. Just read it. I mean, he's pre-capitalist. He's a figure of the Enlightenment. What we would call capitalism, he utterly despised. He people read snippets of Adam Smith, like there's a few phrases they teach in school. So everybody reads the first paragraph of Wealth of Nations, where he talks about how wonderful division of labor is. But not many people get to, whatever it is, page 430 or something, where he says that division of labor will destroy human beings and turn them into creatures as stupid and ignorant as it's possible for a human being to be. And therefore, in any civilized society, the government is going to have to take some measures to prevent division of labor from working. And in fact, his attitude toward market, he did give an argument for markets, but the argument was that under conditions of liberty, markets will lead to equality. In fact, as he put it, under conditions of perfect liberty, markets will lead to perfect equality. And that's the argument for them, because he thought equality is what we should be aiming at. And it goes on and on. I mean, he gave a devastating critique of the policies of what we would call the North-South policies. He was talking about England, he was talking about England and India and so on. He bitterly condemned what the experiments that they were carrying out, which were devastating India. He also made obvious, in fact, he made remarks which ought to be truisms about the way states work. For example, he pointed out that it's totally senseless to talk about a nation and what we would nowadays call national interest. He simply observed in passing, because it's so obvious, that in England, which is what he's discussing, and it was maybe the most democratic society of the day, in fact was the most democratic society of the day. He said in England the principal architects of policy are the merchants and manufacturers, and they make certain that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, no matter what the effect on others, including the people of England, who he argued suffered from their policies. He didn't have the data to prove it at the time, but he was probably right. Well, that ought to be a truism, and it's what was, a century later called class analysis, but you don't have to go to Marx to find it. It's very explicit in Adam Smith, and the reason it's explicit is so obvious that any 10-year-old can see it. So he didn't make a point of it, he just mentioned it. But that's correct, and if you read through, he's intelligent. He's a person who's from the Enlightenment. His driving motives were the assumption that people are guided by sympathy and feelings of solidarity and the need for control of their own work and so on. Much like other Enlightenment and early and Romantic thinkers, he's part of that period. He's part of the Scottish Enlightenment, and the version of him that's given today is just ridiculous. But I didn't have to do any research to find this out. All you have to do is read. You're literate, you find it out. In fact, what I did do a little research in the way it's treated, and that's interesting. So, for example, the University of Chicago, which is the great bastion of, et cetera, they published a bicentennial edition of the hero, a scholarly edition, with all the footnotes and the introduction by Nobel Prize winner George Stigler, a huge index, a real scholarly edition. So that's the one I used, since it's obviously the best edition. And that was interesting. The scholarly framework was very interesting. For one thing, Stigler's introduction was interesting. It's obvious he never opened the book. I mean, they must, I don't know what they teach, but everything he said about the book was completely false. I went through a whole bunch of examples in writing about it. But even more interesting in some ways was the index. So, for example, what I just mentioned about division, he's very well known, Adam Smith, for his advocacy of division of labor. So you take a look at division of labor in the index, and there's lots and lots of things listed, but there's one missing, namely his denunciation of division of labor, the one I just cited. That's somehow missing from the index. And it sort of goes on like this. So there is, I wouldn't call this research because it's 10 minutes work, but if you look at the scholarship, you do. Well, then it's interesting. Actually, I want to be clear about this. There is good Smith scholarship. So if you look at the serious Smith scholarship, nothing I'm saying is any surprise to anybody. Because how could it be? You open the book and you read it and you see it's right in your face, staring in the face. But on the other hand, if you look at the myth of Adam Smith, which is the only one we get, that's the discrepancy between that and the reality is enormous. And this is true of classical liberalism in general. So the founders of classical liberalism, people like Adam Smith and Wilhelm von Humboldt, who's one of the great exponents of the person who inspired Mill and so on, they were what we would call, I suppose, libertarian socialists. Well, at least that's the way I read it. So, for example, Humboldt, like Smith, argues that he says if a person is, he says, consider a craftsman who does some beautiful thing. He says, if he does it under external coercion, like pay for wages, we may admire what he does, but we will despise what he is. On the other hand, if he does it out of his own free, creative expression of himself, under free will, not under external coercion of wage labor, then we also admire what he is because he's a human being. And he said the point of any decent socioeconomic system will be based on the assumption that people have the freedom to inquire and create, he says, the fundamental nature of humans, in free association with others, but certainly not under the kinds of external constraints that later came to be called capitalism. And it's the same when you read Jefferson. I mean, he lived long, Jefferson's a half century later, so he saw the industrial state capitalism developing, and he despised it, of course. He said it's going to lead to a form of absolutism worse than the one we defended ourselves against. And in fact, if you run through this whole period, you see a very clear, a sharp critique of what we would later call capitalism, and certainly of the 20th century version of it, which was designed, in fact, to destroy individual, even entrepreneurial capitalism. There's sort of a side current here, which is rarely looked at, but which is also quite fascinating, and that's the working class literature of the 19th century, which, they didn't read Adam Smith and Wilhelm von Humboldt, but they're saying the same things. You read journals put out by what are called the factory girls in Lowell, the women in the factories who were writing their own newspapers and so on. Same kind of critique there was a real battle fought by working people in England and the United States to defend themselves against what they called the degradation and oppression and violence of the industrial capital system, which was not only dehumanizing them, but was even radically reducing their intellectual level. So you go back to the mid-19th century, these so-called factory girls, young girls working in the Lowell mills, they were reading contemporary literature and, philosophy and so on. And they recognized that the point of this system is to turn them into tools, who will be manipulated, degraded, kicked around and so on, and they fought against it bitterly for a long period. Well, that's the history of the rise of capitalism. The other part of the story is the development of corporations, which is an interesting story in itself. Adam Smith was too early to say much about them, but he did criticize the early stages of them. Jefferson lived long enough to see the beginnings, and he was very strongly opposed to them. But the development of corporations really took place in the early 20th century, very late. In the 19th century, they were considered. Originally corporations existed as public service. They were for a public service, like people could get together to, build a bridge or something, and they would be incorporated for that purpose by the state, and they built the bridge, and that's it. And they were supposed to have a public interest function. In fact, well into the 1870s, states were removing corporate charters. They're granted by the state. They don't have any other authority. They're fictions. They were removing corporate charters because they weren't serving their public function. Well, then you get into the period of trusts, and various efforts to consolidate power were beginning to be made in the late 19th century. And it's interesting to look at the literature. It took a long time before the courts didn't really accept it. There were some hints about it, but it wasn't until the early 20th century that courts and lawyers designed a new socioeconomic system. It was never done by legislation. It was done mostly by courts and lawyers, and the power they could exercise over individual states, like New Jersey was the first state that granted corporations any right they wanted. And, of course, all the capital in the country suddenly started to flow to New Jersey for obvious reasons, and the other states had to do the same thing just to defend themselves. They'd be wiped out. It's kind of a small-scale globalization. And then the courts and the lawyers came, corporate lawyers and so on, came along and created a whole new body of doctrine, which gave corporations authority and power, which they had never had before. And if you look at the backgrounds of it, it's the same background that led to fascism and Bolshevism. And in fact, a lot of it was supported by people called progressives, because for these reasons, they said, well, individual rights are gone. We're in a period of corporatization of power, consolidation of power, centralization, and that's supposed to be good if you're a progressive, like a Marxist, Leninist or something. And out of that same background came three major things: fascism, Bolshevism, and corporate tyranny. They all grew out of the same roots, basically. It's fairly recent. We think of corporations as immutable, but they were designed. It's a conscious design, which did, in fact, as Adam Smith said, the principal architects of policy consolidate state power and use it for their interests. But it was certainly not popular will, and there isn't even any legislation about it. It's basically court decisions and lawyers' decisions, which created a form of private tyranny, which is now more massive in many ways than even state tyranny was. And it does grow. These are major parts of modern 20th century history. You go back to the classical liberals would be horrified. I mean, they didn't even imagine this. But the smaller things that they saw, they were already horrified about. And this would have totally scandalized an Adam Smith or a Jefferson or anyone like that.
Well, let's make a connection between corporations and East Timor and Indonesia. For example, the Nike Corporation is the world's largest manufacturer of sneakers and sportswear and the like, and their headquarters is in Beaverton, Oregon, right outside of Portland. Some years ago, they had set up factories in South Korea. South Korean workers, as prosperity took off there, they started unionizing and demanding better pay and better working conditions and the like. And Nike moved their operations to Indonesia, where they're able, according to John Cavana and others, and Frederick Clermont, actually, someone that you've just written an introduction to a book for, write that workers there are paid $1.35 a day. Nike makes these sneakers in Indonesia for $5.40 and sells them in the United States for $60, $70, $80.
Yeah, Indonesia has been a great favorite of the West ever since 1965, when a huge massacre took place. They slaughtered maybe 500,000 or so people and destroyed the one popular political party there, which was, as everyone agrees, from right to left, the party which was defending the interests of the poor. And this slaughter was welcomed with just absolute euphoria in the West. I've reviewed some of the press coverage. And ever since then, since then, Indonesia, which is a pretty rich country, a lot of resources, has been just what's been called a paradise for investors. It's a brutally repressive state which prevents any labor organizing or anything else, so wages can be very low. In fact, Indonesian wages are now half the level of China, which is not exactly, okay. So they right before the big APEC conference in Jakarta, everybody went to Jakarta to celebrate the free market. As part of the cleaning the place up, they throw the labor leaders in jail. So some of them are in there for long sentences. Actually, some of the sentences have just been increased. There's no labor union. There's a Stalinist-style labor union run by the government. There have been attempts to create independent unions, but they've been brutally suppressed. So Nike's happy because the workforce though they're very militant and very courageous, they are brutally repressed by the state and kept way down. The country's extremely rich. There's a lot of wealth around, mostly in the hands of General Suharto and his family and their cronies and foreign investors. And in fact, even the invasion of East Timor, as I mentioned, was motivated to a substantial extent by just corporate robbery. So a large part of the reason was there's important leaked diplomatic cables from right before the invasion. This is fall of around August 1975, Australian cables, which first of all talk directly about the complicity of the United States. Kissinger ordering the Jakarta embassy not to report anymore on what's going on because the United States is going to support the invasion as it did. Meanwhile, of course, they're publicly denying that they know a thing about it. His point, Wolcott's point, the Australian ambassador, his point, which was followed, was that I think his words were something like this. He says, we can make a better deal on East Timorese oil with Indonesia than we can with Portugal, the administering power, or with an independent East Timor. And in fact, that is now exactly what's going on. Right after Australia was the only Western country to recognize the occupation in the context of negotiations with Indonesia for the Timor Gap Treaty, which is about this. And you recall there was a big massacre in Dili which did focus world's attention on it. A couple hundred people were murdered by Indonesian troops who made the mistake of doing it in front of a hidden television camera and beating up 2 American reporters. You're not supposed to do things like that. You're supposed to do massacres in secret while nobody's looking. And they made that technical error, so there was a lot of coverage for a while. Immediately after that, and here the coverage declines. I have yet to see a word about it in the United States, but maybe some in the business press. But immediately after the massacre, Australia and Indonesia granted licenses to major oil companies to begin drilling for Timorese oil. You have to recall that the official reason that's given as to why East Timor can't be independent is it doesn't have any resources. And that reason is given by the people who are robbing it of its oil resources, which are expected to be quite substantial. So right after the Dewey massacre, contracts were let out to oil companies to start drilling. And if you look at the stocks, you'll notice that they go up and down depending on the latest finds, but you won't discover anything about it when you're reading. And as I mentioned, there is now a world court case right in process right now. The world court case, you really don't know. I mean, it's on kind of technical issues. I mean, like the world court isn't going to deal with the question of whether a country favored by the West is allowed to occupy and massacre other people. That's beyond courts. But they will look at the technical sides of the thing. So these are extremely important issues. In fact, this is the London Financial Times, major business journal, just had an article, I think maybe yesterday on today is the 31st of January, it was the 30th of January, they had an article timed with the opening of the World Court hearing, big article, describing it as one of the most important court trials at all, anywhere, because it is going to establish the basis for commercial exploitation, or to be more accurate, robbery of the resources of a conquered people. That's a major issue. Quite apart from the fact that they also, with U.S. assistance, they managed to slaughter maybe a quarter of the population, a couple 100,000 people, and still going on, of course.
I'd like to put listeners in this office space for a moment. Your desk is actually, it's pretty neat right now. There are usually even higher piles of books, but there are at least 6 or 7 stacks of books and papers, and on your filing cabinets, even more. How do you divide your labor? You've just been away for about 2 weeks. You come back, you have this avalanche of mail, phone calls, things to read. How do you get through this? What are you prioritizing here? Is there an order to this madness?
Well, first of all, it looks remarkably neat now, because while I was away, they did something really nasty. They painted and cleaned the office, which I never would have permitted if I was here. But so it looks surprisingly clean. You may have noticed I'm trying to take care of that. So it does look neater than usual. But if you want to know what it's like, well,
where do you start?
This is a minor part. You've been at our house. Around 7:30 this morning, there was what we thought was an earthquake or something. Huge noise, and bedroom's right next to the study. Went in and discovered that there are these big piles of books up there, 6 feet high, over and over. Well, a couple of piles had fallen, were scattered all over the floor. Those are the books. That's the place where I put the books that are urgent reading, And sometimes when I'm having an extremely boring phone call and trying to think about something, I try to calculate how many centuries I'd have to live in order to read the urgent books if I were to read 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at some speed reading pace, and it's pretty depressing. So the answer to your question is I don't get anywhere near doing what I'd like to do.
Yeah, just in the last year or so, you've written introductions to Paul Farmer's book on Haiti, Jennifer Harbury's book on Guatemala, the Frederick Clermont book on world trade.
Alex Carey's book, and several books of my own, in fact, and a lot of articles, plus all the linguistics, which is some totally different thing. In fact, on the way back from Australia, it's a long flight, about 17 or 18 hours, I guess. I spent it all proofreading a very technical manuscript, which on a totally different topic. Yeah, plus other things. A couple articles coming out in Mind and other philosophy journals.
Well, those long flights must provide at least a sense of respite for you because you're not bombarded with telephone calls and people like me knocking on the door.
Yeah, actually, one thing that surprised me in Australia, and I hope it doesn't come here, is that they're very high-tech in some ways that we aren't. So everybody had a mobile phone. And as we were driving around in cars, phone calls going up and back. And one thing I've always liked about driving, like flying, is that you're inaccessible, but apparently not any longer. So flying is very good in that respect. You're totally anonymous, and nobody can bother you. Yeah.
One of the things I've, obviously observed over the years of working with you and watching you interact is this sense of balance and enormous patience. You're very patient with people, particularly people that ask the most inane kind of questions. I mean, is this something you've cultivated or you've felt that since you've been a kid?
Well, first of all, I'm usually fuming inside, so what you see on the outside isn't necessarily what's inside. But as far as questions and stuff, the only thing that I ever get irritated about is, sort of elite intellectuals. The stuff they do, I do find irritating. I shouldn't, because I should expect it, but I do find it irritating. On the other hand, what you're describing it as inane questions usually strike me as perfectly honest questions by people who have no reason to believe anything other than what they're saying. If you think about where the questioner's coming from and what the person has been exposed to, that's a very rational and intelligent question. It may sound inane from some other point of view, but it's not at all inane from within the framework in which it's being raised. In fact, it's usually quite reasonable. So there's nothing to be irritated about. Maybe sorry for them, and the thing to do is to try to help people get out of their intellectual confinement, which is not just accidental, as I mentioned. There's huge efforts that do go into making people, to borrow Adam Smith's phrase, as stupid and ignorant as it's possible for a human being to be. A lot of the educational system is designed for that. I mean, a lot of the educational system, if you think about it, is designed for obedience and passivity. From childhood, a lot of it is designed to prevent people from being independent and creative. If you're independent-minded in school, you're probably going to get in trouble very early on, because that's not the trait that's being preferred or cultivated. When people go through all of this stuff, plus corporate propaganda, plus television, plus the press, and the whole mass of the deluge of ideological distortion that goes on, I mean, they ask questions that from another point of view sound inane, but from their point of view are completely reasonable.
You either have ESP or you've been looking at my notes, because I was going to ask you a question about education. So you're fond of quoting an anecdote of a former colleague here of yours at MIT, Vicky Weisskopf.
Oh, yeah. Vicky Weisskopf who just resigned, was a very famous physicist, major physicist, and who used to teach introductory. Around here, one of the good things about this place is that the senior faculty teach introductory courses. And he used to teach introductory physics courses. He's one of the most distinguished physicists of the 20th century. He's not a minor figure. And the story, I don't know if it's true or not, but the story about Vicky Weisskopf is that students would ask him, what are we going to cover in the course? And his answer always was, the question is not what we're going to cover, but what we're going to discover. In other words, it doesn't matter what coverage there is. What matters is whether you learn to think independently, and if so, you can find the material yourself. But anyone who teaches, say, science, at least at an advanced level, is perfectly aware of the fact that you don't lecture. You may be standing in front of a room, but it's a cooperative enterprise, and it's more a form of apprenticeship than anything else. Kind of like learning to be a skilled carpenter. You work with somebody who knows how to do it, and you sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't get it. If you get it, you're a skilled carpenter. And how it's transmitted, nobody has anything to say. And science is a lot like that. You just sort of have to get it, and the way you get it is by interacting. So if you go to the same is true here, and say, you go to class in linguistics, you'll find it's a discussion. The people sitting in the seat where you're sitting are usually students, so-called students. I mean, we're talking about things. And that was Weisskopf's point.
Right. So speaking about linguistics lectures, you have this mischievous side to you. Once I told you I was going to be sitting in on one of your afternoon lecture seminars, but I told you I wouldn't be able to stay for 3 hours? I couldn't stay till the end. I'll have to leave early. And you told me as I'm walking out the door, be sure to be nodding my head back and forth and saying, I don't know what that guy's talking about.
I probably, what I should have said is walk out the door saying that you're very irritated at all this nonsense. Can't stand any more of it. But yeah, those are usually 3.5 hour things go on, which is pretty normal. I mean, nothing special about it.
At the Mellon lecture that you gave in Chicago in October, you focused primarily on the ideas of John Dewey and Bertrand Russell, and it was very different from one of the political talks. For obvious reasons, and you were engaged. I mean, not to say you're not engaged in the political analysis as well, but there was really a different timbre to your voice and a tone, and there was a certain intellectual excitement when you were talking about these ideas that really mattered to you, and from what you said, influenced you a great deal.
Yeah, they did. I mean, they influenced me in ways not so much by reading as by living. I mean, it happened that from about 18 months old, I was in I had work. Both my parents were working. I was in school, and what was called school, and it happened to be an experimental school run by Temple University on Deweyite lines. So until I was about, say, 12 years old, I just experienced Deweyite ideas, rather well executed, incidentally. Progressive education isn't what's called that, but this was the real stuff. And it was an exciting period. Later I read about it. I mean, I didn't read about it when I was 8 years old. I just sort of lived it. These were highly libertarian ideas. Dewey himself is, straight out of the American mainstream. But people who read what he actually said would consider him, now you would consider him some far-out anti-American lunatic or something, because he was expressing mainstream thinking before the ideological system had so grotesquely distorted the tradition. By now it's unrecognizable. So, for example, Dewey, not only did he agree with the whole Enlightenment tradition, that, as he put it, the point of production, as he said, is to produce free people, free men. He said, but that's 60 years ago. That's the point of production. It's not to produce commodities. He was a major theorist of democracy, and he had many different conflicting strands to him, but the one I'm talking about held that democracy requires dissolution of private power. He said, as long as there is private control over the economic system, you talk about democracy as a joke. He said, repeating basically Adam Smith, he said, politics is the shadow that big business casts over society. And he said, attenuating the shadow doesn't do anything, so reforms are still going to leave it tyrannical, basically a classical liberal view. And he insisted, his main point was that as the core element of, you can't even talk about democracy, he said, until you have democratic control of industry, commerce, banking, and everything. That means controlled by the people who work in it, the communities in which it is. Standard libertarian socialist ideas or anarchist ideas, which go straight back to the Enlightenment. I mean, there's an outgrowth of views of the kind we were talking about before from classical liberalism. And Dewey represented these in the modern period, as did Bertrand Russell, from another tradition, but again with roots in the Enlightenment. And these are two of the major, if not the two major thinkers of the 20th century, whose ideas are about as well known as those of the real Adam Smith, which is a sign of how efficient the educational system has been, and the propaganda system, in simply destroying even our awareness of our own immediate intellectual background.
In that same Mellon lecture, you paraphrased Russell on education. You said that he promoted the idea that education is not to be viewed as something like filling a vessel with water, but rather assisting a flower to grow in its own way. It's kind of really poetic, too.
That's actually an 18th century idea. I don't know if Russell knew about it or reinvented it, but you read that standardly in early Enlightenment, in Enlightenment literature. That's the image that was used. And that's essentially what Weishaupt was saying, too. Humboldt, again, founder of classical liberalism, his view was that education is a matter of laying out a string along which the child will develop in its own way, but it'll develop in its own way. You may sort of do some guiding, and that's what serious education would be, from kindergarten up through graduate school. Now, you do get it in advanced science, because there's no other way to do it. That's why you have it. But most of the educational system is quite different. The mass education was designed, remember, to turn independent farmers into docile, passive tools of production. That was its primary purpose. And don't think people didn't know it. They knew it, and they fought against it. There was a lot of resistance to mass education for exactly that reason. It was also understood by the elites. Emerson once said something about how we're educating them to keep them from our throats. If we don't educate them in what we call education, they're going to take control of this, what Alexander Hamilton called the great beast, namely the people. The anti-democratic thrust of opinion in what are called democratic societies is really ferocious. It's not mild, it's ferocious, and for good reasons. Because the freer the society gets, the more dangerous the great beast becomes, and the more you have to be careful to cage it somehow. On the other hand, there are exceptions, and Dewey and Russell are among those exceptions. But they are completely marginalized and unknown, although everybody sings praises to them, as they do to Adam Smith, because what they said would be considered intolerable in the autocratic and near totalitarian climate of dominant opinion. Which is, the totalitarian element of it is quite striking. The very fact that the concept anti-American can exist, forget the way it's used, the very fact that it can exist it exhibits a totalitarian streak that's pretty dramatic. That concept, anti-Americanism, is the only real counterpart to it in the modern world is anti-Sovietism. In the Soviet Union, the worst crime was to be anti-Soviet. And it's kind of like a hallmark of a totalitarian society to have concepts like anti-Sovietism or anti-Americanism. Here it's considered quite natural. Books on anti-Americanism by people who are basically Stalinist clones are highly respected. And that's true of Anglo-American society, which are strikingly the more democratic societies. And I think there's a correlation there. As basically Alex Carey's point, as freedom grows, the need to coerce and control opinion also grows, if you want to prevent the great beast from doing something with its freedom.
These qualities that I think you're looking for and want to elicit from your students, a sense of inquiry, skepticism even, and challenging you, and maybe just saying, you're a nice guy, but, you don't know what you're talking about. How do you foster those? You come in with a certain amount of baggage into a classroom. People say, oh, this is Noam Chomsky, the father of modern linguistics and all that. Do you find students are in awe of you and are hesitant to speak out?
Not most, no. Most of them are pretty independent-minded, and they soon pick up the atmosphere around, which is you walk around, you'll see it's a very informal atmosphere of interchange and cooperation, and that's standard. If you find, these are ideals, you may not live up to them properly, but it's certainly what everyone's committed to. There are students who find it harder, especially ones who've come from Asian backgrounds, because they've had a tradition of authoritarian teaching. So some of them break through quite quickly, some don't. But by and large, the people who make it into elite graduate programs are that tiny minority who haven't had the creativity and independence beaten out of them. It doesn't work 100%. And especially, actually there was interesting stuff written about this by Sam Bowles and Herb Gintis in their work on the American educational system some years back to economists, and they pointed out they're sort of right, that the educational system is kind of divided in fragments. I mean, the part that's directed towards working people and the general population is indeed designed to impose obedience. But the education for the elites can't quite do that. It has to allow creativity and independence. Otherwise, they won't be able to do their job of making money and that sort of thing. Actually, you find the same thing in the press. I mean, that's why I read the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times and Business Week. I mean, they just have, they just have to tell the truth. And I think that's a contradiction in the mainstream press too. Say, take the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever. They have dual functions and they're contradictory. One function is to subdue the great beast, but another function is to let their audience, which is an elite audience, gain a tolerably realistic picture of what's going on in the world. Otherwise, they won't be able to satisfy their own needs. That's a contradiction that runs right through the educational system as well. And it's totally independent of another factor, namely just professional integrity, which a lot of people have, and honesty, no matter what the external constraints are. And that leads to various complexities. And, if you really look at the details of how the newspapers and so on work, you find those contradictions and problems playing themselves out in complicated ways.
Do you find that when you're doing these one-on-ones with the students in your office that they're more open and communicating easier with you?
Than in class?
Yeah.
Well, my classes have a funny property, which is, I've never, you did sit in on one of those?
A couple of them.
Yeah, okay, well, they've become a kind of institution. So there is this Thursday afternoon seminar, which, the participants are from all over the place. There's about 8 students registered and about 100 people there. There are faculty from, people coming over from the entire northeastern part of the United States flying in, people flying in from Maryland and Montreal and Ohio and so on and so forth, and plenty of Europeans. There are visitors. There's a lot of faculty. There are people from different fields. There's, people teaching mathematics and universities around here. All kind of people around. And then there's all the former students, like these might be first or second year class, but all the third and fourth year students are around, and everyone. So the people who are actually taking the class tend to be somewhat intimidated. The discussion is mostly among faculty and that sort of thing. And what I've done over the years is just break the class into 2. So there's 2 or 2.5 hours, or of this kind of free-floating interchange with everyone, and then everybody gets kicked out, and only the actual students are left, and then they feel less intimidated by the presence of all of these famous people around. And then they're just discussion sections, which they run. I don't have any agenda for them, so it's whatever they feel like talking about. And that's turned out to be a useful way to run the courses over the years, to take care of this special problem that arose.
In addition to your office being relatively neat and tidy, there's also some additions to the photography section of the Chomsky office. Could you bring us up to date on these new additions?
Yeah, I've got, there's the latest edition, 3 grandchildren sitting in a bathtub over there. So sure, I try to keep the other side of life, something to look at that's nice.
Well, actually, I have a motive in asking you this question, because we're in the era of family values now, of course, and children. You've been citing a UNICEF study by the economist Sylvia Ann Hewlett on child neglect in rich nations. What's that about?
That's one of several interesting studies. That's the best. Came out in 1993, has yet to be mentioned anywhere as far as I know, which UNICEF usually studies poor countries, but this is a study on rich countries and how they take care of children. And she's a good, well-known American economist. She found basically the last 15 years, 2 different models. There's an Anglo-American model and a European-Japanese model, and they're radically different. The Anglo-American model has been basically a war against children and families. The European-Japanese model has been supportive of families and children. And it shows She shows, the statistics and everything show it very well, as does experience. In Europe and Japan, family values have been maintained, families have been supported, children don't go hungry, so on and so forth. Parents stay with children. There's bonding in early childhood because parents are, both husbands and wives, are purposely given time to spend with children and so on. There's daycare centers, a whole support system. The United States and England, on the other hand, are basically at war with children and families and have destroyed them purposely. Purposeful, conscious social policy has been to attack and destroy family values and children. So we have extremely high rates of child poverty and malnutrition, child abuse. Parents and children have very little contact under the Anglo-American system. In fact, contact time has fallen about 40%, in large part because you have two parents who have to work 50, 60 hours a day just to survive, a week to keep the children alive. So you have latchkey children, television supervision, abusive children, by children, violence against children, and so on. The amazing thing about the United States, and this is an intriguing element of our totalitarian intellectual culture, is that the people who are carrying out this war are able to say that they're defending family values and nobody cracks up in ridicule. That takes a real totalitarian intellectual climate. The fact that nobody discusses it publicly, this is serious research, not the kind of junk that's called research, that's also revealing.
Right. I'm getting a signal that we have to wind up. But one last question apropos of this. You've been citing some Hallmark cards that reflect this. First of all, I want to know, where did you get this? Where did you get these Hallmark cards?
I didn't get them. That's reported in the same study. As part of Sylviane Hewlett's, the UNICEF study discussion of the breakdown of families under the conscious social policy of the Anglo-American system, she just mentions that as one sign of it, this line of Hallmark cards, one of which is intended to be put under a child's breakfast cereal, saying, have a nice day or something, because the parents are out somewhere, and the others to be tucked under the pillow at night, saying, "Wish I were there," or something. And she just gives that as an illustration, of what's also shown by the heavy statistics, Incidentally, this is not the only such study. There was a bestseller in Canada by, actually, a woman who's a personal friend of mine, Linda McQuaig, who's a writer, I think. Used to be a journalist and became a freelance writer. She wrote a book. She's a very good social critic. She wrote a book on the Canadian model. And so it's Canada-focused, but she pointed out rightly that Canada's kind of poised between the Anglo-American model and the European model, and moving towards the Anglo-American model, and she describes in some coding under the pressure of the Anglo-American system that they're part of. And as I say, the book was a bestseller in Canada, but you're not going to find it around here very much. Actually, my own book, Necessary Illusions, was also a bestseller in Canada. It was never even reviewed here. And there are other studies, and the facts are quite dramatic. I notice you have a reference.
Yesterday's Denver Post, of course, the obligatory Super Bowl coverage dominates the front page, but there's a new study that just came out about 6 million U.S. kids are poor, and the number's increasing.
Yeah, child poverty in the United States is just off the scale. Poverty altogether is off. The United States is the most unequal distribution anywhere of any industrial country, and that's been radically increasing in recent years. And poverty among children is just awesome. In New York City, it's about 40% below the poverty line. Actually, New York City has a higher level of inequality than Guatemala, which is people know what that means. But poverty among children is enormous. Malnutrition is unbelievably high. In fact, and getting worse. The same is true of infant mortality, unique in the industrial world. The same is true of even simple, and it's social policy. Take, say, family leave. Most civilized countries nurture that. They want parents to be with children when they're little. That's when bonding takes place, and a lot of child development takes place in those early months, even neural development. It's well known. So, in a civilized country, you try to provide for it. The United States does not even have the level of plantation workers in Uganda for these things. Well, that's part of the war against children and families, and in general against poor people, that's carried out under the rubric of family values. The idea is, look, only rich people should have state support. They have to be subsidized by massive transfer payments like Newt Gingrich and his constituents, but poor people have to be smashed. And that means poor means most of the population. You're going to make them more and more poor. Incidentally, it's not only children who are suffering poverty, but also the elderly, surprisingly. There was a big article in the Wall Street Journal recently about how starvation, in their words, is surging among the elderly, reaching like maybe 15 or 16% of the population over 60. Again, that's a phenomenon unknown in industrial societies, and indeed unknown in poor societies, because there they have support systems, maybe extended families or whatever. But we're unusual. We have no, civil society has been basically destroyed. Family structure's been devastated. And there is a powerful nanny state, but it's a welfare state for the rich. That's an unusual system. And it comes from having a highly class-conscious business class and not much in the way of organized opposition.
I'm afraid I'm going to be thrown out of here in an organized fashion. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Noam.
Okay.
Well, I want to, first of all, impress upon our listeners about how competent and able we are, because the other day we got off to a real Marx-like start, and I don't mean Carl. I forgot to turn the tape recorder on. Then when I did, the phone rang, and when the phone rang, you spilled your entire cup of coffee on the floor. So that was a really auspicious...
I'll avoid that by cutting the phone connection. Yeah.
Well, and just on a pile update, I see there has been some shifting of the piles. It seems on the left-hand side, it has grown considerably.
Well, we've got a Barsamian thermos cup on top of one of the piles, which helps.
And piles on the file cabinets behind you have grown significantly, just in a couple of days. So anyway, let's sort of continue a little bit about Australia and what you found there. We did talk about East Timor, but in terms of the Australian economy, are they also part of this neoliberal paradigm?
Well, Australia is the only country in history, I think, that has decided to turn itself from a rich first world country to an impoverished third world country, and is now, unfortunately, busily at work at it. Australia is in the grips of a fanatic ideology called economic rationalism, which is a kind of a souped-up version of the free market theology that's taught in economics departments, but that nobody in the business world believes for a second. It's the ideology which has been forced on the third world, which is one of the reasons why it's such a wreck, but which the rich countries have never accepted for themselves. They've always insisted on and demanded massive state intervention and protectionism, the United States usually leading the pack since 1800. And you see the differences between, you go back to the 18th century, the first world and the third world weren't all that different. They're rather different today, and this is one of the reasons. Australia, which is, it's in the Anglo-American orbit and not a leading power, obviously, it's a small country, they have taken the ideology seriously, and they are what they call liberalizing their economy, meaning opening it up to foreign penetration and control. And the main sources of capital in that area, it's a big growth area in the world. In fact, it's, with one exception, it's an enormous growth area. The one basket case is the Philippines, the one that we have been, that's been enjoying our tutelage for a century. But apart from that, you're not supposed to notice that, but apart from that, the area is in a big growth boom, pretty awful ways, but nevertheless a growth boom. And the source of it is mainly Japanese and overseas Chinese capital, which are two big concentrations, two big sort of imperial concentrations, basically. Though the overseas Chinese one is scattered, it's not territorially based. And what they're trying to do is pretty clear. They want to turn Australia into their Caribbean. So they'll own the beachfronts and have the nice hotels and the Australians can serve the meals, and there'll be a lot of resources that they can pull out, and so on. And Australia is still a rich country. In fact, time of the First World War, it was the richest country in the world. So it has lots of advantages, and it's not going to look like Jamaica very soon, but it's heading in that direction. So since they dropped tariffs in this neoliberal fanaticism, the manufacturing deficit, meaning the ratio of manufacturing imports to exports, has increased very sharply, meaning they're importing manufacturers and exporting resources, and exporting, services, tourism, basically. It's moving in that direction, and it's under very careful design with a lot of smugness, because the economists, who studied at the University of Chicago and so on, probably believed the stuff they were taught. It has no relation to the real world, and as I say, business leaders have never been willing to tolerate it for a second. But it is part of the ideological fanaticism that is part of the technique for smashing down poor people and sometimes rich people who take it on for themselves and suffer the consequences. Same thing happened in New Zealand.
Remind our listeners of Australia's role in the U.S. attack on Indochina.
Australia, the Australian documents have been released up till the early 1960s, and we now know that the Menzies government, the government of Australia in the early 60s, was greatly afraid of Indonesia. That was their big concern. That concern still hasn't abated, in fact. And they are on the edge of Asia. They regard themselves as a white outpost on the edge of Asia, and there's always a yellow peril concern, very racist. It's being overcome now, I should say, but back then it was very racist. They felt that they had to switch from the British fleet used to be what protected them, but illusions about that collapsed during the Second World War when the Japanese very quickly sank the British fleet, and they realized that their protection is going to be the United States, so they better be a subservient client to the United States. And as the U.S. moved into Indochina, they went along. They provided not a huge amount of aid because it's a small country, but they sent troops. They carried out plenty of torture, atrocities, and so on. And it's for two reasons. I mean, part of it was just service to the big power, the big guy who's supposed to protect them, but partly because they shared the U.S. geopolitical analysis, which was very straightforward. That there could be a demonstration effect of successful independent development in Indochina, and they were worried about the same thing from China in those days, and that could spread. It could, as they like to put it, infect the region. It could be an infection that would spread over the whole region, and the way you get rid of an infection is you destroy the virus and you immunize the potential, those who it might reach, and they did. They helped the United States destroy the virus. The United States had basically won the Vietnam War by the early 70s, as was clear to the business community. Nobody else seems to be able to understand it yet. And in the region, they simply supported the installation of extremely brutal, murderous regimes. The most important was Indonesia, in fact. In Indonesia, there was a major event. The CIA described it correctly as one of the major events of the 20th century. CIA pointed out in its report, which has since come out, that the slaughter that took place was the greatest, ranks right up with the Nazis and Stalin. And they were very proud of it, of course, and said it's one of the most important events of the century. And it was. Indonesia is the rich area that they were afraid of, that they were afraid might be infected by the spread of independent nationalism. And when the generals took over in the late 60s, General Suharto, in what the Times called admiringly a staggering mass slaughter, that put an end. What they destroyed was the one political party in the country. It was basically the party of the poor, which everybody agrees on. And there was no threat. And the U.S. records have incidentally also come out through the 80s at least, although they're keeping very secretive about them. They've been very selective in what they've released. It's a little unusual. It's also been noticed by scholars. But there's enough there to know that what they were afraid of was that the PKI, the one political party, would win an election if there was ever an election. So therefore democracy had to be destroyed. And the only alternative was they tried a military coup and a rebellion, and it didn't work. The only thing that could work was this boiling bloodbath, as it was called in the U.S. press, which very much satisfied the United States. There was just total euphoria here across the board, and the same in Australia. And then the same thing happened pretty much in Thailand and in the Philippines and so on. So the region was inoculated, the virus was destroyed, Australia took its part in it, since then, they've been sort of incorporated in the U.S. What's called defense system, military system. So that's their relationship to the United States, but they have a separate relationship to Asia. And that's the relationship of increasing subordination to Japanese and overseas Chinese capital, which is quite visible. For example, I think of the three, if I remember correctly, of the three largest exporters, two are Japanese multinationals, which is a standard third world pattern developing.
Darwin, in his Voyage of the Beagle in 1839, wrote, "Wherever the European has trod, death seems to pursue the aboriginal." How did the indigenous population of Australia fare, the Aborigines, and did you have any contact with them while you were there?
Some. In Tasmania, they were simply totally exterminated. In Australia, they were driven inland, which means sort of desert. Just now, they're beginning, as in the United States, after a couple hundred years. It's now 200 years for Australia. They're a young country as compared with us. They're beginning to recognize Aboriginal rights, land rights issues, and so on, and there is an independent Aboriginal movement. Up till now, it's just been extreme racism, and probably even maybe worse than the American record. I don't know. It's kind of on a par, but it's a little changing, and now there are Aboriginal rights groups. I was able to meet some of them, in fact. I was invited by the Timorese, and they're in contact with them. There has been some legal recognition now of Aboriginal land rights and some limited rights to resources, but it's the usual. It'll happen to the extent that the popular forces press it, as usual.
There's been a noticeable shift in the emphasis of your public talks and writing over the last decade. I mean, there's much more focus now on trade and economic issues. When did that occur? How did that come about?
It came about from the early 1970s, really, when the issues shifted. Some major events took place in the early 1970s, very significant. One of them was the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, which we've talked about, and that's one force that set in motion very substantial changes. It gave a big acceleration to the growth of multinationals. Transnational corporations now have an enormous role in the world economy, and these are just incredible private tyrannies. That make totalitarian states look mild by comparison. The other huge change was the extraordinary growth in financial capital. The figures are just, first of all, it's exploded in scale. It's absolutely astronomical. There's maybe close to $1 trillion moving every day in just trading. And it's also the total composition of capital in international exchange has radically shifted. So in around 1970, before the destruction of the Bretton Woods system, which means regulated exchanges and so on, about 90% of the capital in international exchanges was real-world related to investment and trade, 10% speculative. By 1990, the figures had reversed. By 1994, the last report I saw was 95% speculative, and it's probably going up since. And that has extraordinary effects. Its effects were noticed by James Tobin, the American Nobel Prize-winning economist, in an important speech he gave at the as presidential address of the American Economic Association in 1978. So that's in the early stages, and he pointed out that this rise of financial capital speculating against currencies is going to drive the world towards a low-growth, low-wage, and though he didn't mention it, high-profit economy for obvious reasons. And he therefore, because what financial capital wants is basically stable money. It doesn't want growth. That's why when you read headlines in the paper saying, Federal Reserve fears growth, or fears employment. We've got to cut down the growth rate, the employment rate. You have to make sure that Goldman Sachs gets, enough money on their bond holdings and so on. And it was obvious this was going to happen. He suggested at the time a tax on speculative capital, just to slow down the rate of capital exchanges. Of course, that was never done. But it's coming up in the United Nations. I mean, it'll be smashed, of course, but it's still being discussed, just simply to try to shift the balance towards productive investment instead of speculative and destructive interchanges. Incidentally, it's had an enormous effect on the news business. The big wire services, like, say, Reuters and AP, which is connected with Dow Jones and Knight Ridder, they do give news, but that's a secondary effect. I mean, what the main thing that they do is interact instantaneously with financial markets. So when say if Clinton is giving a speech, the AP and the Reuters and Knight Ridder reporters will be there, of course. And if he says a phrase indicating, say, maybe we're going to stimulate the economy, they race off with their mobile phones in their hands, and they call the central computer and say, Clinton said X, and then the guy who's 24-hour-a-day manning the computers types right off to, thousands of terminals around the world, Clinton said X, and maybe $700 billion move around in financial markets. And the three wire services compete to make sure who gets there first. I was told by a reporter who works for Reuters that every day they get a record of how they ranked as compared with AP and Knight Ridder, and it's in the microseconds. You got to get there half a second before because there's huge amounts of money at stake. And all of this is completely destructive to the economy. It tends towards low growth, low wage, high profit, and that's essentially what the wire services are about these days. I mean, yes, there's news on the side, but that's sort of slow stuff for us guys. With the increase, the telecommunications revolution, of course, expedited this, which is incidentally another state component of the international economy that didn't develop through private capital. It developed through the public paying to destroy themselves, which is what it amounts to. So this was all going on since the early 70s. It really hit big in the 1980s, and primarily in the Anglo-American societies. So under the Reaganites and Thatcher, and with a spillover effect in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. It's all sort of one culture area. You get this development. We talked last time about the effects on families and children, but that's just one effect.
Where does the collapse of the Mexican economy factor into this?
The Mexican economy is, I just got a phone call a couple of days ago from a journalist in Mexico telling me that I'm a big figure there now because they'd had an interview with me in one of the main Mexican journals a couple of months ago in which I said this is all built on sand and it's going to collapse. This was obvious to anybody. I mean, it's what's called a Ponzi scheme. You borrow money and you use what you've bought to borrow more, to what you've borrowed to borrow more money, and finally the whole thing collapses because there's nothing behind it. How any economist could have... First of all, the economists who know anything about Mexico didn't miss it. They all knew it. It's the ideological fanatics who didn't notice it or claimed not to. It's a system of kind of presidential... The free market reform, so-called privatization, which everyone says is such a wonderful thing. That means giving away public assets for pennies to rich cronies of the president. Every president of Mexico, including Salinas, the one we're supposed to love, comes out a billionaire for some reason, as do all of his friends and associates. The number of billionaires you look at the Forbes list of billionaires, they went up from, I think, 1 to 24 or something from 1989 to 1993 during the huge economic miracle. Meanwhile, the number of people below the poverty rate increased at roughly the same rate. In fact, wages have fallen about 50%. The point of NAFTA, part of the point of NAFTA, was to totally destroy the Mexican economy. By opening them up to much cheaper imports from the United States. The U.S. has a advanced state-subsidized economy, so therefore you can produce things very cheap. The idea is to wipe out middle-level Mexican business, keep the multinationals. I mean, there are Mexican-based multinationals. Keep the monopolists, keep the billionaires, lower wages. That's good for U.S. corporations, and they can move over and, get workers at a fraction of the wage. It's a very repressive state. They don't have to worry about unions and regulation and so on. Meanwhile, Mexico's just been, there's been a lot of capital flowing into Mexico, but it's well known that it's speculative. And as far as the rich Mexicans are concerned, they just export their capital. They're not going to keep it there. So probably rich Mexicans lost very little from this devaluation. For one thing, they all knew it was coming because it's so totally corrupt that it was all known on the inside. And if anyone looks, they'll find that Mexican capital was mostly overseas and probably went overseas very fast shortly before the devaluation. So the people it's the American investors who are in trouble, like Goldman Sachs and the big Wall Street firms. In fact, one Mexican specialist, Christopher Whalen, very conservative, incidentally, who advises businesses and so on, called the current scheme, the phrase was something like, Rubin and his friends, the scheme to bail out Rubin and his friends, Treasury Secretary. The Europeans know this. Just this morning, in fact, the main European countries announced that they were going to back off from this. They don't see any particular point in bailing out rich Wall Street firms. But it's another one of those techniques by which you get the American taxpayer to pay off rich Americans. This is essentially what happened with the debt crisis back in the early 80s. Mexico had a huge debt. The debt was to U.S. banks, but they don't want to pay the cost. So the debt was basically socialized. When the debt is sort of moved over to the international funding institutions as it's been, that means to the taxpayer, because they don't get their money from nowhere. They get it from taxes. Yeah, sure. I mean, it's just the standard. It's exactly really existing capitalism. Profit is privatized, but costs are socialized. The Mexicans, if Mexico wants to develop, it's going to have to do it the way every other country did, by not closing itself from international markets, but focusing on domestic development, meaning building up its own resources, protecting them, maintaining them. It's got plenty, not giving them away to outsiders. And they're going in exactly the opposite direction. So part of this bailout is that Mexico is essentially mortgaging its one major reserve, the oil reserves. I mean, the U.S. has been trying to get hold of those for 40 years, and now we got them. Incidentally, Pemex, the big Mexican company, is probably completely broke. I mean, it looks good on the statistics, but if any serious accountant took a look at it, they'd probably find it doesn't have any capital. Because it has been, relative to other big oil companies, it's been doing very little capital investment, meaning, and that has a very simple meaning, it means you're not getting ready to produce for the future. But they do have the oil, and U.S. energy corporations would be delighted to take it over. Mexico is going down the tube, but that's what's called an economic miracle. And it's not the only one. This is true of the hemisphere.
It was really interesting to watch how this played out in the mainstream press. You've often talked about the needs foreign countries to satisfy Wall Street investors. Rarely have I seen it so blatant as in this case, where the first finance minister, who was then sacked, goes up to New York, makes a case, and the Times wrote, New York investors not pleased with him. He goes back to Mexico, gets fired, replaced by a new guy, and he goes up to New York, as did other finance ministers from Argentina and elsewhere, and the line was, New York investors take a liking to him.
Yeah, I mean, this one was so blatant you couldn't conceal it. It was all over the front pages. And, I mean, in fact, it's kind of interesting in Congress. I mean, the current Congress is, it's not really a straight big business institution the way the Democratic Party usually is. So it's got a kind of a mixture of very reactionary nationalist fanaticism, based a large part of it is based on phony business, like yuppie style, business, and some of it on kind of middle level, more nationalistic business, and they don't like it. They're not in favor of bailing out the big Wall Street firms. So you've had congressional opposition and people like Pat Buchanan and so on and so forth. I mean, what's happened here is very interesting, actually. I mean, if people weren't suffering, you're kind of looking at it from Mars. It's sort of interesting to watch. The business community, big business, for years has been trying to undermine and roll back the whole social contract, the welfare system, and so on. But you can't approach the population. There are votes. And you can't approach the population and say, look, vote for me, I want to kill you. That doesn't work. So what they've had to do is to try to organize people, as have other demagogues, on other issues, what they like to call cultural issues. So what they've organized is Christian fundamentalists and jingoist fanatics, and a whole range of extremists, plus plenty of people who live off the government but pretend that they're entrepreneurial, like the yuppie high-tech culture, all publicly subsidized, but they pretend all sorts of entrepreneurial values, and they're all big libertarians and so on, as long as the government's paying them off enough. Gingrich is a perfect example. But so that collection of people is the only ones they could mobilize. Well, it's not hard in the United States. This is a very it's a depoliticized society. It has no civil society. It's all been destroyed. It's kind of like Iran, if you look at it cross-culturally. Very deep fundamentalist fanaticism, widespread fear, very frightened society. People are always hiding in terror. The jingoism is extraordinary. I mean, there's no other country that I know of outside the Soviet Union where you could have a concept like anti-Americanism. I mean, almost any country would laugh if you talked about that. But in the Soviet Union or the United States, it's considered a perfectly normal thing. And this is all the result of lots of corporate propaganda and other such things. But the result is they have now got a tiger by the tail. It's a little bit the way probably Hitler's bankers felt by the late 30s. The only way they were able to organize people was in terms of fear and hatred and jingoism and subordination to power and so on. And pretty soon they had these maniacs running around taking political control of the state, which the state is a powerful institution. And we're getting something like that in the United States. So that there is an anti-big business mood among the troops that big business is mobilized. And the reason is they couldn't mobilize them on any other grounds. You couldn't mobilize them on the real project, namely kill yourselves. That won't work. So you had to do it on other projects, and there aren't a lot around. So you get something like, I don't want to draw the analogy too tightly because things are different, but has something of the feel of Hitler Germany and of Khomeini's Iran, in which similar sorts of things took place. The business sectors in Iran, the merchants, the bazaar, and so on, the guys who wanted to get rid of the Shah, they did organize Islamic fundamentalists, and they weren't happy with the result, and something similar is happening here.
Is that the major internal problem that you see for the rollback crusade?
It's I don't know how big a problem it is, because the point is that the concentration of private capital is by now so extraordinary and so transnational in scale that there isn't much that can be done in political systems to affect it. The London Economist had a great phrase that sort of captures it. They were describing the elections in Poland where the Poles, not understanding how wonderful their economy is, voted back all the old communists into power because they all, in fact, about half the population of Poland says they were way better off under communism. But we know that it's an economic miracle. They don't understand it. And the Economist assured its readers that it didn't really matter because, as they put it, policy is insulated from politics. So in other words, these guys can play their games, but there's enough private tyranny to ensure what the World Bank calls technocratic insulation, keep doing the same things no matter what these guys say at the ballot box. And probably that's true. If you look at the programs that are being pushed through now, they're very carefully crafted to protect the rich. The New York budget that came out yesterday was a very good example. It's worth taking a close look at. It cuts down. They say they're lowering taxes, but it's a total lie. For example, if you lower public state support of mass transportation, that has one immediate consequence, namely costs of riding public transportation go up. And that's a tax, except a very carefully crafted tax, not on guys who ride around in limousines, but on working people. So, in fact, they will cap income taxes. In that sense, taxes are being cut. You don't pay more than a certain. The high level, and the tax system is getting less progressive, so it caps taxes, and they'll cut taxes. But meanwhile, they'll increase taxes for the poor. People have to ride the subway. Elderly people who are at home, let's say, can't get out and need shopping services, that's going to be cut. In fact, the idea is cut anything from. They don't go after Medicare because rich people get Medicare, but they went after Medicaid, which goes to poor people, and cut mental health services and so on. The rich will get them anyway. In fact, the whole idea, you look at the budget carefully, it's a very carefully honed class warfare designed to smash the poor even more. Poor I don't mean welfare mothers. I mean working people. I'm talking about 80% of the population. Smash the poor more, enrich the rich, and you have to remember what these places are. New York City now has higher inequality than Guatemala, which is unimaginable in an advanced country, and they want to make it worse. Well, that's with all the sort of so-called populism and fight for the middle classes and whatever these guys may scream about. Those are the policies that are getting rammed through.
A couple of months ago, Secretary of Labor Robert Reich said, okay, if you're going to talk about welfare, let's talk about corporate welfare. How far did that idea go?
He gave a talk which was well reported in the foreign financial press. London Financial Times had a big report on it, and it was sort of mentioned around here. It was shot down instantly by the White House. They told him right away to shut up. The Wall Street Journal had a nice article about it a couple of weeks later in which it was a good article, actually, they have good reporting, in which they reported about the enormous subsidies that are being given to corporations under the new Gingrich program, which he says is just going to make boardrooms delighted. And then in the course of the article, they said, well, Robert Reich did make this speech about ending corporate welfare as we know it, but he was instantly shot out of the water by the White House, and it was made very clear that no such plans were on the agenda. Quite the opposite. We're working for you guys. Don't worry about it. That was ending, but it's a sort of a term that's in the public eye at the moment. Although very little mentioned in the United States and instantly destroyed.
Robert Siegel is the co-host of National Public Radio's All Things Considered. In an exchange he had with a colleague of mine who lives in Pittsboro, North Carolina, who recorded your presentations at Durham and in Raleigh, also in November, actually, coincidentally. Siegel says that attacking welfare for the rich is a staple of mainstream democratic rhetoric, and Chomsky's observation about this is not exactly cutting-edge stuff.
Yeah, of course, I've been talking about it for like 15 years, 20 years or so, but he may believe that. He was a news director for NPR, with some something in NPR, I think.
He's all things considered host.
Considered host. Yeah, so he probably doesn't know anything about the facts. I mean, these guys are just supposed to read the words that somebody puts in front of their face. But, the fact is it was shot down instantly. It's not a Democratic staple. In fact, the Democrats made it extremely clear and explicit that they weren't going to let this go anywhere, and Reich was called on the carpet for it. However, I don't say that he's lying. He may simply not be aware of the facts, which is very likely.
Well, but he doesn't leave it at that, talking about you, because my colleague asked him, well, why don't you have Chomsky on once in a while? And he said he wasn't particularly interested in hearing from you, and that you, quote, evidently enjoy a small, avid, and largely academic audience who seem to be persuaded that the tangible world of politics is all the result of delusion, false consciousness, and media manipulation.
He knows about as much about that as he does about the the staples of democratic political discourse. Actually, I did have a discussion with him once, which was kind of interesting. In a book of mine called Necessary Illusions, which is on the media mainly, was given over Canadian public radio, national radio, as invited lectures there, and it was been published, and it was in fact a bestseller in Toronto. I don't think it was ever. I never saw a review here, as far as I recall. But there was a fair amount of public pressure on NPR. They have on All Things Considered, they have a authors interview program. So under various kind of pressure, they finally agreed to let me have one of those 5-minute interviews. It was with him. I didn't listen, but it was announced at 5 o'clock. One of those things. 5 o'clock. They announced this was going to be in the next half-hour segment, and people listened. I didn't, and it got to 5:25, and it hadn't been there. And then there were 5 minutes of music. At that point, people started calling stations saying what happened, and they didn't know what happened, so they started calling Washington. And the producer of the program said it had played. And you remember this. She said that because it was on her list, it had played. And then people asked her to check and so on, and it turned out it hadn't played. Then she called me. I mean, I didn't pay any attention one way or another, and kind of apologetic, and said that with what was not a very convincing story, saying that she'd been overruled by some big mucky-muck there. She was kind of annoyed. I don't think she said it never happened to her before. So somewhere between 5:05 when it was announced and 5:25 when it was supposed to go on, it had been canceled by somebody high up. And she claimed that the reason was that they thought Robert Siegel's questions weren't pointed enough. So she asked me, would I do it again? That means, so I said, sure. It means pain in the neck going down to the station, running on the south. So we went down again, and he tried to ask pointed questions, and, well, you can draw your own conclusion. But that they did run. That's our one interchange. As to the audience, there's... there's some truth to it. I mean, it's true that in the United States, there's some countries, the United States is one, the other one was Soviet Union, where I have almost no access to the major media. But that's unique. It's not true anywhere else in the world. First of all, there are plenty of audiences in the United States. I mean, I don't have any problem talking to the people I'd like to talk to. In fact, I can't do a fraction of it. And they're not academic. They're, popular groups and churches and whatever. But there is, he's got the thread of truth beneath what he says is that in the United States, as in Russia, the major media were very sure to make sure not just that not me, but anybody with a dissident voice is out. So you showed me that right after I came back from Australia, and there I was, I gave a talk at the National Press Club, which was nationally televised right at the Parliament building, and I was not talking about the United States. They wanted me to talk about Australia's foreign policy. So I talked about Australian foreign policy to a nationally televised audience. It was not very polite, very critical, because I think their foreign policy is disgraceful. And I was all over. I was on their Asia. They have a World Services program beamed to Asia, so I was interviewed on that for about half an hour on the Timor Gap Treaty, very important thing, which is all over the press and papers, and that's everywhere. I mean, I have articles. Well, I just mentioned Mexico, but I have articles appearing in major journals everywhere up and down the hemisphere. I just had one in Israel's major journal, an invited critique of their foreign. They don't want me to talk about the United States. Critique of the peace treaty, so-called peace process. And it's the same is true in Europe. So as far as Robert Siegel's concerned, there are two possibilities. Either he knows something that no one knew outside of the Soviet Union. So maybe he and the commissars know something that nobody else knows. That's one possibility. Or there's another possibility. There's another point of similarity between those two groups, and people can make their own decision.
All right, let's turn to one of our favorite topics, which is, of course, sports. There is a major labor action going on that a lot of people know about, and that's the baseball strike. Have you been following that?
Not.
You haven't been following it. Well, there's an interesting component to this, which I think you should know about. The owners are demanding that their workers, the players, put a cap on their earnings, on the ability of the workers to make money. But no similar cap is being asked to be put on the owner's ability to make profits.
Yeah, well, that sounds like the norm. And I'll bet you, without looking at it, that most of the population is blaming the players. I suspect, just the way, I haven't looked, but the way media and corporate propaganda usually works.
That just played out here in Massachusetts. Governor Weld wants to give money to the owner of the New England Patriots to spruce up the stadium and create luxury boxes and road infrastructure and the like. And there was a poll in yesterday's Boston Globe. Most of the people want it. They think it's a good idea. That's not welfare.
Yeah, no, because it goes to rich people. So it's, and in fact, this is part of the. Again, it's a matter of people paying for their own subordination, because whatever one, maybe it's fun to watch baseball games and so on. In fact, I like it too. But the fact of the matter is that the way this stuff functions in the society is to marginalize people. It's part of the tech. It's kind of like gladiatorial contests in Rome. The idea is to try to get the great beast to pay attention to something else, not what we were doing. That's what all the hoopla is about.
Decatur, Illinois is the site of three major labor actions. Staley, which is a British-owned company. Bridgestone, which is the number one tire and rubber maker in the world, is Japanese-owned. Caterpillar, as you know, the number one producer in the world of earth-moving equipment. At Staley, there's a lockout. At Bridgestone and Caterpillar, the workers are on strike. And the New York Times is calling this a testing field in labor relations, and it's also saying that Decatur, more than any place else, labor is trying to halt its slide toward irrelevance.
Yeah, well, there's a whole long story here. The U.S. has an extremely violent labor history, unusual in the industrial world. And the workers here didn't get the rights they had in Europe until the mid-30s. They had those rights half a century before in Europe, even in reactionary countries. In fact, the right-wing British press, like, say, the London Times, couldn't believe the way U.S. workers were treated in the 1920s and the 30s. Then finally, the U.S. workers did get some rights, and it caused total hysteria in the business community. They thought they had the whole country by the throat, and they learned that they didn't. And they immediately started a counterattack. It sort of was on hold during the war, but took off right afterwards with huge campaigns to, what was the phrase? There was a nice phrase that one of the corporate leaders used. He says, there's a everlasting battle for men's minds, and we have to win it, and they put billions of dollars into this. I mean, there was a time when, in the early 50s, when all this stuff was going on, when I think business-made movies were reaching about 20 million people a week. It was just a huge campaign. They had what they called economic education programs, meaning teach people, what we want the truth to be. And they forced workers and plants to go to them. That was called release time, meaning you got to go to these courses, and there were millions of pamphlets distributed and so on. The anti-communist crusade was tied up with this. That's its real meaning, in fact. It was a way of using fear and jingoist sentiments to try to undermine labor rights. The labor bureaucrats play their own role in this, but the effect of this was very much to weaken the they were worried at the time. By the end of the Second World War, the U.S. was a social democratic country, and the population was. So about like almost half the workforce thought that they'd do better if the government owned factories than if private enterprise did. And when you talked about, and the unions, remember, in the late 40s, were calling for worker rights to look at books and to intervene in management decisions and to control plants. In other words, to try to democratize the system, which is a horrifying idea to pure totalitarians like business leaders. And so there was a real struggle going on. And it worked through the 50s, largely driven by anti-communist fanaticism. In the 1980s, it really took off, but then they had the advantage of having a criminal state behind them, so which makes crime a lot easier. There are laws on the books, at least, which say that you're not allowed to fire union organizers and that sort of thing, and the Reagan administration simply said they wouldn't enforce them. So, in fact, the firing of organizers shot up. The number of industrial accidents went way up because they stopped enforcing any of the laws. And through the 80s, the unions were just really crushed. The Caterpillar strike, there's a series of those. The first Caterpillar strike was critical because it was the first one in which the government endorsed the hiring of what they call permanent replacement workers, in other words, scabs. The U.S. was condemned by the International Labor Organization for that, which is extremely unusual. The ILO is a very conservative organization, and they don't offend their big funders, but they did call the U.S. on the carpet for that and called on the U.S. to adhere to international labor standards. Maybe Robert Siegel reported it on NPR. I'm sure he did. But this was a major event, and this is the next stage. They now feel, because of these developments in the international economy, business tastes blood. They think they can roll back the whole social contract that's been developed in the past century through popular struggle, labor rights, human rights, rights of children to have food. I mean, anything other than making profit tomorrow. What's more, it's important to remember that we don't have a capitalist economy because such a thing couldn't survive, but it's quasi-capitalist. So there are market forces and there's competition. And in such a system, you're driven to very short-term goals. Part of the nature of that kind of system is you can't plan. So you want to make profit tomorrow. Like if you don't show a good bottom line tomorrow, you're out. Somebody else is in. And the result is they destroy themselves. That's, in fact, one of the reasons why business called for regulation, government regulation, about a century ago. When they were playing around with laissez-faire, they quickly saw it's going to destroy everything. So much of the regulatory apparatus was put in under business control, but now they're much more fanatic, and they want to destroy the regulatory apparatus. And it's clear what that's going to mean. In fact, the timing was kind of almost delicious, right in December, last December, when the Republicans were announcing their moves to try to eliminate and demolish the regulatory apparatus by a variety of methods, which is what they're planning to do. Right at that time, there was a series of reports that came out about some of the effects of having done this in the 80s. One of the most striking was right here in New England. The George's Bank, which is the richest fishing area in the world, they had to close a lot of it down. And now New England is importing cod from Norway, which is sort of like Australia importing kangaroos from Turkey or something. I mean, it's and the reason they're doing it is Norway preserved its fishing grounds. They have a different philosophy, as they put it here. Our philosophy is to rob everything as much as possible and forget about tomorrow. And their philosophy is to consider the needs of the population. So it's like different philosophy. Now, what happened is that the Reagan administration combined subsidies to the fishing industry with deregulation. Well, you know what that's going to mean. You pay off people to deplete fish resources, and you don't regulate what they do, and they deplete it. And in fact, they've depleted groundfish. And whether they'll recover or not, nobody really knows. In fact, scientists are, don't know enough about it. But maybe they've destroyed the richest fishing area in the world forever, or maybe somehow it'll be able to recover. But this came out at the same time that they were announcing further cutbacks in regulation. Then along comes the Mexican collapse. Yeah, it's another example. Deregulate everything, but give but use state power to enrich the rich, which is what the privatization is. Then you can see what's going to happen. Incidentally, in the same weeks, the NASA, space agency, came out with new satellite data announcing strong evidence, that the best evidence yet for rise in sea level, very sophisticated data, which means the effect of global warming, and also announcing the same satellite data that tracing the effect of the depletion of the ozone layer to industrial chemicals and that sort of thing. That comes out at the same time that they're saying, let's cut back the last residue of regulatory apparatus. But it makes a certain sense. If the sole goal, human value, is making as much wealth as you can tomorrow, and you don't care what happens down the road, and you don't care what happens to anybody else, then it makes perfect sense. If it destroys the world, well, not my problem.
We hear these horns and things in the background. What's going on? Is this office over a railroad track or something?
Well, it's actually an improvement over what it once was. When I got here in the 1950s, it was an industrial area then. The industrial areas all been wiped out. And in fact, all the working class areas have been leveled, I should say. But it's called urban renewal. But at that time, we were between a leather factory, a tire burning factory, a chocolate factory, and a soap factory. And depending on which way the wind was blowing, you had a nice combination of odors. But now it's mostly government-supported high-tech small industries, that sort of thing.
That's not a train?
Yeah, there's trains. There are very few trains around. In fact, trains you can forget about. Part of the cutback, one of the current gimmicks is the reason why trains have been destroyed was because of the U.S. government carried out probably the biggest social engineering project in history in the 1950s. Pouring huge amounts of money into destroying the public transportation system in favor of cars and airplanes, because that's what benefits big industry. In fact, it started with a corporate conspiracy to buy up street railways and so on. That suburbanized the country. It changed the country enormously. That's why you got shopping malls out in the suburbs and the wreckage in the inner cities and so on. It is a huge state social engineering project. But it's continuing. So, for example, a couple of years ago, the Congress passed a Mass Transit Act, a Transportation Subsidy Act. It was to give the states money to support transportation. And it was intended to maintain public transportation and also to fill potholes in roads. But the figures just came out, in fact, in the same month of December, I should say. And it shows something like, 96% of it or so went to private transportation and virtually nothing to public transportation. Well, that's the point of getting things down to the state level. If you can, big, huge corporations can play around with governments these days, but state governments, they can just control totally. They can play one state against another much more easily than one country against another. And that's the purpose of this sort of what they call devolution. Let's get things down to the people, to the states, where the corporations can really kick them in the face and nobody has a chance. So the idea will be that you get block grants that go to the states, no federal control, meaning no democratic control. It will go precisely to the powerful interests. And we know who they are. The construction business, the automobile corporations, and so on, meaning whatever there is of public transportation is very likely to decline. Yesterday's New York budget is a striking example. It calls for increasing the fares. It doesn't say it, but it implies increasing the fares for public transportation and decreasing service while making sure that the guys in the limousines are doing quite fine. So, yeah, you hear a couple of trains in the background, freight trains, incidentally, but unless they can be shown to serve private power, they're not going to be around long.
In Chicago in October. Yeah.
Incidentally, one of my favorite remarks in diplomatic history is there's a great book on Brazil by a leading diplomatic historian who's also a senior historian of the CIA, who describes with enormous pride how we took over Brazil in 1945 and we're going to make it a testing area for scientific methods of development in accordance with capitalism, and we gave him all the advice and so on. He's very proud of this. Total wreckage, but who cares? But part of the advice that the U.S. gave Brazil was to Brazil had been a kind of a European colony, so their railroad system was based on the kind of European model, which works. And part of the advice was to switch it over to the American model. Now, if anybody's ever taken a train in pre-Thatcher England or France and then in the United States, they know what that means. But he said this with a straight face. Incidentally, another part of their advice was to destroy the Amazon. But
to change the topic, in Chicago in October when you were there, a woman in the audience asked you, a pretty straight-ahead question. She said, Professor Chomsky, how come you don't factor gender into your analysis? And you pretty much agreed with her, but then you really didn't answer her question. Where does that play in?
Yeah, in fact, I've been writing about it quite a bit, and then some of these latest articles, this discussion, what we discussed last time about the effect on families, is essentially gender war. The very fact that women's work is not considered work is an incredible ideological attack. As I pointed out, it's somewhere in between, lunacy and idiocy. You can pick your point. The idea is that raising children, the whole welfare debate, as it's called, is based on the assumption that raising children isn't work. It's not like speculating on stock markets. That's real work. So if a woman's taking care of a kid, she's not doing anything. And domestic work altogether is not considered work because women do it. That gives an extraordinary distortion to the nature of the economy. And in fact, it amounts to transfer payments from women altogether, and working women in particular, transfer payments to others. They don't get Social Security for raising a child. You do get Social Security for other things. And the same with every other benefit. So, I haven't written as much about this stuff as I should have, probably not, but it's a major phenomenon. It's and should be very, very dramatic now with the take these latest New York welfare plans again, or the ones they're thinking about in Congress. One of the things they're going to do is to force women under 21, if they want to get welfare, if they're under 21, to live with their families. Well, you take a look at those women. A very substantial percentage of them are that they have children as a result of either rape or abuse within the family and so on. Now they're going to be they can't run their own, these advocates of family values say either you send your kid to a state orphanage or you live with a family which may be an abusive family and may be the source of your problems. But you can't set off on your own and raise children because that's not work and that's not a life. You have to get into the labor market. All of this is a major phenomenon in contemporary American affairs, and in fact in the history of capitalism. Part of the reason why capitalism looks successful is it's always had a lot of slave labor, half the population. What women are doing isn't counted.
I've never heard you, for example, use the term patriarchy, and while not wanting to, hold you to the fire with particular terms, is it a concept that that you're comfortable with?
Yeah, in fact, I do. I don't know if I use the term, but I certainly use the concept. When I'm asked about, say, what I mean by anarchism, let's say, I always point out that what it means is an effort to undermine any form of illegitimate authority, whether it's in the home or between men and women or parents and children or, corporations and workers or the state and its people or whatever. It's all forms of authority. They have to justify themselves. They almost never can. But it's true. I haven't emphasized it.
Right. Are there any books by feminists that you read and that you value?
I sort of read it, but it's not, what I read, I sort of know, so I'm not learning anything. Maybe other people are, so it's worth doing. And I think it certainly changed. I think it's had a very positive effect on the general culture. But unless you call things like this study of child care and so on feminist literature, which I wouldn't, I just call it straight analysis. No, I don't know it very well.
Right. Let's, in the remaining time we have, let's talk a little bit about Russia, which has been just a great success story. The military attacked the parliament, and they managed to win that battle. But what about the awesome display of Russian military might in the Chechen Republic? Did that impress you?
Well, I think what happened in Russia was completely predictable. I've been saying for forever that the Cold War was basically an attempt to drive Russia back to the Third World where it belonged and where it had been for half a millennium. And that's what happened. So right after 1989, not only Russia, but most of East Europe goes into free fall, returns to Third World conditions. The old Communist Party is doing fine. So they're happier than they ever were. They're richer than they ever were. In fact, inequality's grown enormously. The leadership is mostly the old nomenclatura. Those are the guys the West always liked and wants to do business with now. But the UNESCO just did a study just on the human effects of the so-called reforms, which they approve of, incidentally. And they estimated that in Russia alone, there's about 500,000 extra deaths a year as a result of the reforms that we're so proud of. That's a fair degree of killing, even by 20th century standards. And the country is being taken over by the same leadership is in control. So Yeltsin, for example, who the West's favorite, they like him because he's a tough old party boss, and knows how to kick people in the face and so on. Meanwhile, there's the rise of a huge mafia, like every other third world country we take over, starting from southern Italy in 1943, but in fact all through the world. There's major mafia. Incidentally, Mexico too. Mexico is under the economic miracle is increasing. The government is increasingly linked up with cocaine cartels and so on. Jeffrey Sachs made his fame, this guy who goes around telling countries how to destroy themselves. He made his fame by the economic miracle in Bolivia. But what's usually only pointed out in the footnotes is that they stabilized their currency all right, but mostly by shifting to cocaine exports, which is perfectly rational under the advice that he gave them of becoming an agro exporter. So it's happening in Russia too. Huge mafia spreading to the United States because plenty of immigrants here. Selling off resources, like in Kazakhstan, there's, which is a lot of resources. There's American businessmen all over the place trying to buy up the oil, etc. And if a country that's that well behaved wants to carry out massacres, the U.S. isn't going to object. And in fact, the U.S. has been quite supportive of the Chechnya massacres. Right.
Here I am with this, this barrage of questions written out, and it's sort of like I'm dealing with a loaded deck, and you're just sitting there. It's like Russian roulette in a way. Speaking of Russia, you don't know what's coming next. Are there ever any questions like where you're thinking, why doesn't he ask that? Or, he's really missing the point.
Your questions are so perfect. How could I think of that?
That wasn't a setup. That was. Have you any sense of maybe cutting down on your public speaking schedule?
Well, actually, I have to cut down a bit this spring because I got some extra teaching, which I've doubled the teaching load I usually have. But no, not in general. Actually, I have to sort of think about what I'm going to do for the next couple of years anyway. Retirement age isn't that far away, but I don't know. I haven't really been thinking too much to do to think about the future.
Yeah. In all these talks that you've given, you must have reached hundreds of thousands of people, and the articles, the interviews, the radio, the TV, and all that. It just must put a tremendous, not just a physical burden on you, but an emotional burden. Everything is sort of riding on your shoulders, and I'm sort of concerned about that, just as a friend.
I don't feel that way at all. I feel I'm riding on other people's shoulders. Yeah. When I go to give a talk in like Chicago, say. I just show up. They did all the work. Yeah. All I did is take a plane and, give a couple talks and go home. I mean, the people who were there did all the work, and it's the same everywhere. Like I just came back from Australia. Those guys had been working for months, to set everything up, and they're still working. I mean, I went, had a nice time, talked to a bunch of places. I mean, I'm exploiting other people, Actually, it's mutual exploitation. I mean, there's something, I'm not trying to be modest about it or anything. There's some things I can do, and I can do pretty well. Actually, over the years, I've tried my hand at a lot of things. So I did.
Like what?
Well, I did spend a lot of time, believe it or not, organizing and going to meetings and, that sort of, like in the early days of Resist, which I was one of the founders of. I religiously went to all the meetings and sat there and was useless and bored and so on. And finally, out of all of this, a kind of division of labor emerged just by sort of mutual consent. That we would all do the things we can do, and there's some things I just can't do at all, and there are other things I can do very easily. So I do the things I can do easily. But the serious work is always done by organizers. There's just no question about that. They're the ones who are down there every day, doing the hard work, preparing the ground, drawing, pulling, bringing out the effects. I mean, there is absolutely no effect to giving a talk. It's like, water under a bridge unless people do something with it. If it is a technique, if it is a device for getting people to think and bringing them together and getting them to do something fine, then it was worth it. Otherwise, it was a waste of time, self-indulgence.
Speaking of resistance, what forces, do you see in the society that can resist this right-wing onslaught?
Well, the whole population, an overwhelming majority of the population is very strongly opposed to everything that's going on. The question is, can they be successfully diverted and dissolved and separated from one another and so on? We talk about having to teach lessons in democracy to Haiti. Anyone with a gray cell in their head would just laugh and collapse in ridicule at that. We have to learn lessons in democracy from Haiti. Here's a country in miserable conditions, worse than anything we can imagine, where the population was able, on their own effort, to construct a lively, vibrant, functioning civil society with unions and grassroots organizations and so on, and actually without any resources to sweep their own president into power and create an actual democratic society. Well, of course, it was smashed by force with us behind it. Nobody's going to smash us by force. But if we could learn the lessons in democracy from Haitian peasants, we could overcome these problems.
On that note, why don't we wind it up and maybe you can make some headway on these piles.
Okay.